Good morning and welcome to A New Way Forward, Reimagining the Nonprofit Workplace virtual engagement series, presented by Council of Michigan Foundations, Michigan Nonprofit Association, Michigan Community Resources, and COACT Detroit. This engaging and interactive multi-part series is designed to provide guidance to nonprofits throughout Michigan as you consider re-entry into the workplace. Sessions are grounded in equity and designed to balance the exploration of legal, HR, and financial requirements, as well as ways to strengthen team culture, redefine the workspace, and realign to mission. I am Kelly Kuhn, Vice President of Michigan Nonprofit Association, and I will serve as your host. Before we begin, we want to express our appreciation to anyone returning from last week's kickoff session, as well as extend a warm welcome to those joining us for the first time. We have a great session planned today and are thrilled to have our panel of experts here to share their knowledge, guidance, and experience in topics that address legal guidance for safely returning to the workplace. Our moderator will be introducing them shortly. A few housekeeping before we begin. The webinar is being recorded. The recording and slides will be shared afterward. We have built-in time for questions and answers. All participants are muted, so please use the chat function to ask your questions. Also, as you know, the information around COVID-19 is moving at a rapid pace, and the situation is ever-changing. We are all doing our best to understand and apply what we can. This context is important to express as we begin today, as our presenters plan to share guidance which should not be construed as legal or financial advice. This session is as part of a series, and upcoming sessions are on your screen. Our kickoff session took place last week, and the slides and webinar recording are available on each of our presenting organizations' websites. Now, to introduce your moderator, Jami Tata. Jami serves as a program manager for Michigan Community Resources and comes with 15 years experience in the nonprofit field. Prior to joining MCR, he held positions with educational institutions, agricultural organizations, community development corporations, and arts and cultural groups across Detroit. Jami is an avid literacy educator and runs literacy initiatives through a community organization he founded, No Allegiance Nation. Jami also leads the Oakland Avenue Artists Coalition. As program manager at MCR, Jami supports the Kresge Innovative Projects Detroit, otherwise known as the KIPD initiative. He does this by providing coaching to individual grantees and leading cohorts of grantees. Jami is passionate about building the capacity of Detroit residents to reclaim and sustain thriving neighborhoods. Welcome, Jami.
Oh, thank you, Kelly. That was a wonderful intro. And welcome to everyone. I'm excited for the presentations here today. Allow me to introduce our first speaker, Brian Berryman. Brian is a senior risk advisor with Huntington Insurance with over 18 years in the business. As a certified work comp advisor, he specializes in helping clients control their cost of labor to help maximize productivity and profitability. Brian and the entire team at Huntington are committed to providing guidance and helping organizations navigate these challenging times and best protect their greatest assets. Brian will also tell you that his biggest accomplishment, however, is his beautiful wife and 3 kids. Please welcome Brian Berryman.
Jami, thank you. Thank you to everybody attending today. It's my pleasure to offer any guidance that I can to help you get back into the workplace, or if you've stayed in the workplace and you've stayed open, to help you understand what you can do to protect your biggest assets. If you could move to the next slide, it'd be great. So from a nonprofit, we're reopening. Okay, now what? It seems that every 30 days something different changes. So what is our goal? As an organization, you want to protect your employees. The protocols, what protocols do you have in place? Do you have PPE? What are the rules, the training, the documentation? This is a lot of information to gather, coordinate, and provide to your staff. I mean, you want to make sure that your employees are safe. They're coming back to the workplace, and there's still a ton of unknowns out there in terms of, what are we supposed to do? What do we do? Are we safe? Who's safe? Who's at risk? We don't really know. And then how do we protect the visitors, our clients and our patients? Is it mask, no mask? Do we provide PPE? What kind of signage? What kind of training? Those are all questions that we want to provide guidance to. Our assets, we're protecting the assets, our company, the employees, our board, our donors, our volunteers, the things that help us move forward as a nonprofit. Protecting the management. It's a giant balancing act. We have the directors and officers. How did they manage the nonprofit through the pandemic? The liability claims. What if somebody gets COVID at work or doesn't do something, or somebody feels uncomfortable? Employment practices. I hate to say this, but some organizations have had to lay off employees. How is that done? We're seeing upticks in claims. Accident and health claims. Your volunteers, are they covered? They still want to volunteer. Maybe they've lost their job. They don't have their medical insurance. So all of this seems overwhelming. And what we want to do today is provide you with a roadmap of where to get this information, what resources to use, and how can you leverage your individual resources as well as the community, the nonprofit community. If we can move to the next slide. The putting the plan in place. So, okay, we have all of this stuff to worry about, and then we have to make sure that we meet all these guidelines, and we have to have it written and in place, within 2 weeks of reopening. That's the requirement that we have now. So it's a 10-point plan, or the 10 requirements. So we have a ton of stuff to work on, and it's not easy. Some organizations are larger than others, but looking at this, if we can go to the next step, I've tried to make it as simple as possible. If we go to the next slide, the next steps, we know what we have to do. So we know that we have to meet these requirements. We know who we have to protect and how we want to protect them. So my advice and what we can do to reopen in the workspace is to, on the next slide that we have here, is we want to be nimble. So let's seek guidance from our current resources. We'll I'd advise asking your current risk advisor, what do they have available in terms of reopening documents or templates? You can have a general industry reopening guide available where you come through and you can, it's an editable form. It provides information from the CDC, how to put the plan in place, how to form a team, what the response is going to be. Ask for their loss control team or our loss control team to provide social distancing protocols, cleaning resources. Where do we get all this stuff? So reach out to your current advisor from a property and casualty standpoint or from an employee benefit standpoint, and they should have this information readily available to you. Also, I've partnered with Signal Restoration, and they have a great slogan. It's called Be Future Ready. So if you're at an organization and you have an office building and you have an infection, now what? What's your plan? You don't want to be caught flat-footed. Signal Restoration will come out and provide a cleaning plan for you. So you have somebody, it's just, okay, we've had a case of COVID. What can we do? We know that we have a certified company that can come out. We know the cost. We know what it's going to be. We've budgeted for it. We have the protocols in place, and so we can get it taken care of right away. Then create the plan and implement it. However, you have to be flexible as we move forward because we don't know what's going to happen. So if you look back to June 1st compared to June 26th, so many things have changed. It feels like a lifetime ago. Don't fall into the paralysis by analysis. You put the plan in place, and then you implement it. You train your employees, educate your employees, do everything you can to educate your visitors to your organizations, the clients of your organization, and let them know that it's, we're monitoring this. You don't have to monitor every day, but I look at, what's going on from a month-to-month basis, and make sure that you're able to change as the times change. You're seeing different states right now that went from fully open to they're slowing down the reopening, and some are actually dialing it back. So what are you going to do when that happens? How are you going to prepare? So, have that plan and be ready to change. Legal assistance. This is the biggest thing. So when you get your plan you put it in place, you have your advisor review it, then you send it to your counsel, whether it's going to be your on-staff counsel, people you partner with, or anybody there. You want to have them review it. You want to make sure that it's sound. Then you have them sign off on it and get that taken care of. So you've really done everything that you're supposed to do. So you've sought advice from your risk advisor, you've worked internally, you've created a plan, you've put pen to paper, and you've had it reviewed by your legal team. And then always remember, the plan and the rules will change, so be ready to change with them. I can't stress it enough. We sit down and we have conversations. I sit on a few what we call pandemic response teams for our nonprofit organizations. And it seems that every time we have a meeting every 2 weeks, we have to strike 3 or 4 things and add 2 or 3 things. So be ready to change. It seems daunting, but when you sit down with your team or whoever you need to, put it to paper and put the plan on paper, and then move forward knowing that it's not going to be perfect. But if you look back and think that you're protecting everybody involved, the company, the employees, your patients, if you center it around that, you're going to be in a great position to move forward, and it will get easier as we move forward. So those are the steps that I have and the recommendations. I'm always available to chat if you have any questions. My contact information's there. So if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to help.
Thank you, Brian. I'm excited to learn all the knowledge that you have shared. We have one question that was sent in beforehand, and we may have time for one question before we move on to the next presenter. And the question is around emergency plans. How do you account for emergencies of rebellion in your risk mitigation plans, such as those that refuse to wear masks and other PPE, especially when you may not have security or these people bypass security? Did you hear me, Brian?
Jimmy, I apologize. If I'm having trouble hearing anything, I can see you on the screen, but if I'm not getting any audio from you.
Can you hear me now? Brian, can you hear me?
Yep, there we go.
Oh, you can hear me now.
Are you able to hear? I'm sorry. Are you able to hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you. The question that was posed was around emergency plans. How do you account for sort of emergencies of rebellion in your risk mitigation plans, such as those that refuse to wear masks or other PPE, and especially when you may not have security or those people bypass security? How do you plan for such sort of emergencies like that?
The great mask debate, and I apologize for the technology issues. It's on par for 2020. Once you have a firm, your organization stance on masks, if they are required, you are going to have situations where people will refuse to wear masks. And what I suggest is if you look at your current situation, security versus no security, And what is the chain of command and how do we want to handle this situation? The first thing you want to do is de-escalate the situation and have a protocol in place that if person A does not wear a mask, then it goes to the manager and then they address it this way. And then you just plan for every scenario to make sure the situation doesn't escalate into a confrontation. So that is my recommendation, is try and prepare for everything, knowing that the situations are going to be fluid and you're going to have to adapt after the first situation when you learn more.
Thank you, Brian. Kelly, if there's one question that is being prominently brought up, please ask it. If not, we'll go on to the next presenter.
Yeah, you bet. We actually have one question that has been raised so far. And again, for those that are joining, please feel free to put your questions into the chat function. And again, we will monitor the questions throughout the presentation and present them accordingly to the presenter. A question that came up is whether or not there's help or assistance with their liability insurance. So again, I think we've talked about it in the presentation so far, but maybe could you speak a little bit more as I think about your opening slide in protecting management? Can you talk a little bit more about liability insurance, or how and where that may come into play, whether that is different insurance plans that an organization has, and if a scenario were to play out, how would they know which part of their insurance plans or what insurance plans, and as it relates to liability, given scenarios and things that we know have been presented or are likely to be presented as people think about returning?
That's a great question. From a liability perspective, the typical insurance for the program is going to be a general liability policy. If you have a board of directors, it's always prudent to purchase a director's and officer's liability. The type of claims that potentially could arise are going to come from your general liability, your directors and officers, and or your workers' compensation. So the advice that we recommend is to have a thorough review with your current advisor, looking at all situations of any potential claims. What we're seeing is the better you plan in terms of having a program written down with the things that we talked about, protecting the employees, protecting visitors, clients, patients, as well as the company board. If you put a plan in place so you are prepared for a situation, that will reduce any type of liability that an organization potentially has. When you come up for your renewal, one of the things that the insurance carriers are asking is, do you have a pandemic response plan? And it's good to say, or it's good to have that plan, or let the carriers know that you're putting it in place or you're seeking guidance to have one in place, because anything that the board does or doesn't do could put them at risk. And that's just me being conservative. We don't know if there's going to be a lot of claims or what the carriers don't know. So it's kind of a fluid situation, but our recommendation is to have the planning in place, because that provides the protection, and it allows your insurance carrier to be more comfortable, with your organization and the risks that potentially could, be associated with COVID.
Yeah, so what I hear you saying, again, not just to your the question being asked and the need to have a plan in place, but to be thinking about a plan in place as it relates to your liability insurance. And it sounds like your carriers are even going to ask whether or not you've got a written plan in place, it sounds like, from your explanation.
Yes, every renewal that we've been working with, they've asked, do you have a pandemic response plan? What is your plan to lay off people during the crisis? How are you doing it? What are you doing? So working with your risk advisor, your human resources team, and your human resources, essentially your HR resource, to have those plans in place is going to be prudent, because carriers are asking, and they're going to want to know that those plans are in place.
Great, thank you for that additional clarification. That appears to be the hot question that was wanting some more information. So again, if you, we will have some time at the end. If another question comes about, please feel free to put that into the chat function. We've also put into the chat function a reminder that Brian has shared resources as part of the presentation, and those are in the handout section. And we've also shared a link to Michigan Community Resources Legal Clinic. So again, if you're not monitoring the chat function or haven't teed up a question into there, there is some additional resources and information for you there.
Thanks, Kelly. And thank you, Brian. I'm going to introduce our next speaker.
Thank you.
And Brian will be back on during the end with the Q&A with all the presenters. So thank you, Brian. And our next speaker is Felicia O'Connor. Felicia is a senior counsel and labor and employment litigation lawyer with Foley and Lardner. She frequently represents and counsels clients on a wide range of labor and employment issues. Felicia, along with the other lawyers at Foley and Lardner, has a long history of pro bono service to nonprofits through work with organizations like Michigan Community Resources, as a commitment to providing quality legal services to ensure every person in the organization, regardless of financial means, has access to the justice system and to trusted guidance. Please welcome Felicia O'Connor.
Thanks so much, and hopefully you can see me and hear me. I want to welcome everyone, as Brian did and as Jami did, to this webinar. And I think it's, as everybody knows, you know, this topic has really sort of taken over not only labor and employment specifically, but also just, you know, every aspect of our lives. And you'll see that some of what I'm going to say is going to echo what Brian said at the beginning and throughout his comments, really. A key issue, and really, if you take one thing away from this, it is where to find certain resources, how to understand what the requirements are, and also to be nimble, because as we know, they're changing. And as Brian was talking about how he has meetings every 2 weeks and something's different, in my labor and employment group nationwide at Foley, we had for a long time throughout this a meeting every single week, because there was so much information coming out, so much changing every single day, that we really had to meet that frequently to keep on top of all of it. And I don't think that's going to change just because we're reopening. If anything, it'll probably become even more important to try and stay on top of the recent changes, because as has been discussed, as we reopen, hopefully not, but it's certainly a possibility that cases will increase in Michigan. We've seen that in other areas. We've seen phased reopenings sort of rolling back or pausing. So it's certainly a possibility that that will happen here, and the current executive orders and CDC guidance can change, and does frequently change. So if there's one thing you can take away, as I mentioned, it's really that you need to be flexible, you need to be nimble, you need to understand how to find out information, what your resources are, and your legal resources. I mean, certainly I'm happy to help anyone at any time, and so reach out if you have outside counsel or inside counsel. Rely on them heavily, because, you know, it's our job to kind of stay on top of all of these things while you all try to do your normal day-to-day jobs and not have this completely take over what you're doing. So if we could advance to the next slide, that'd be great. Perfect. So a few of the things I'm going to talk about, and some of my slides are a little dense, I'm not going to read every single thing on there, but we're going to talk about planning for reopening, and then also some legal considerations that you should think about, including the ADA, which is the Americans with Disabilities Act, as you probably know, and also some various leave laws and how to think about how COVID impacts reasonable accommodations, sick leave, other leave that people are entitled to and what issues might come up in the workplace. So we'll start off with reopening the workplace, and we'll talk about planning, which Brian obviously emphasized heavily, as well as thinking about your office space, thinking about testing, what parameters are around there. You know, testing is a medical examination under the ADA, so you have
It appears we are experiencing some technical issues with Felicia, so bear with us as we get that back. And maybe if we can, while we're working on that, could we go in advance to the next presenter, and we will work with getting Felicia's connection back. It appears we've lost her completely.
Yes, we can. Going to be introducing Doshia Barton. Doshia is the Director of Administration at Eastern Market Partnership with a passion for leading people as exhibited by her almost 14 years with Eastern Market. For those who are not familiar, since its beginning in the 1800s, Eastern Market is a cornerstone of Detroit, nourishing its residents by providing fresh and nutritious food throughout southeastern Michigan. In more recent years, Eastern Market, a 501c3 nonprofit, has built an infrastructure around the market to support their mission to enrich Detroit nutritionally, culturally, and economically. Thank you for joining us, Doshia.
Thank you, Jamie, and thank you all for having me with you this morning to speak on how we were able to adjust to the age of COVID here at Eastern Market. If you will adjust the slide, advance the slide, please. Eastern Market pre-COVID, that is the look that everyone knows us as. We are always diverse. We're full of people, laughter, and joy. And actually, that happens to be a Flower Day picture, the pre-COVID Flower Day picture, which is very, as you all may know, we weren't able to do physically this year. But just to talk a little bit about how we were able to adjust here at Eastern Market. If you could advance the slide, please. Okay, actually Brian and actually Felicia would have hit on a lot of this as well, and what we were able to do here, and basically being in contact with our attorneys and insurance agents to make sure that we were in compliance and wouldn't cause any issues. But what we see here is a picture of a couple of our food box programs. So once our state went into a shutdown mode, here at Eastern Market, we sort of switched our operations to an essential business mode, meaning that we only had our food vendors here. As you know, we have material goods vendors who sell all types of clothing and arts and crafts. When we made that change, we had to not allow those vendors on the markets so that we could use those spaces for social distancing between our farmers and our other food vendors under the sheds. And so the one thing, the food box program, that was one program that we were able to put into place to assist customers who didn't feel comfortable coming to Eastern Market, because of course our pre-COVID picture shows when someone visualized going to Eastern Market, that is what they are accustomed to seeing, especially in April and May, when flower season really ramps up. And so what we did through some grant funding is we were able to start an online food box program. We started that program, I believe it was maybe early April. And when we started that, our initial purchases were anywhere between 600 and 1,000, with boxes selling out within the hour of that going online, which was just an indication of people not wanting to be out in the crowds, or honoring the stay at home order. So this is also one box is our food box program. The other picture is our senior food box program, which was a contactless way of delivering healthy foods to our seniors, because again, Eastern Market is all about providing healthy, nutritional food to individuals. And so we were able to do the senior food box program through a USDA grant. And you can see our staff are packing those boxes and getting them ready to be delivered. And so we would deliver and drop off. There was no contact with the seniors, and we partnered with seniors that we would normally, complexes that we would normally partner with during our Tuesday markets, where we had various programs for seniors to come and shop. And so to assist our customers, our senior customers, with their shopping, we delivered to them. And then if you could advance to the next slide. And here are the signs that you would see throughout Eastern Market. As I like to say, we are the kings and queens of signs here at Eastern Market. But this is how we were able to assist people in being comfortable with shopping here at Eastern Market. We also provided staff at the entrances, kind of directing our customers, kind of pointing out the signs as well, to let people know that wearing a mask was a requirement, to be mindful of the social distancing. One of the things that Brian and Felicia also mentioned is being nimble. And that was something that we had to learn here at Eastern Market, and we put it into practice. Is, when COVID first hit, we set up the stalls where the vendors were socially distanced, but then we felt, they weren't far enough back from the customers. So we made adjustments along the way. As we like to say in all of our staff meetings here, we're building this plane as we fly it. And so it worked out well for us. One of the other things that we did here at Eastern Market, as you know, we have a lot of wholesale houses in the district, be it produce, be it meat. And so when the state went into shutdown mode, of course, a lot of our businesses lost a lot of their business through the schools and the hospitals and the hotels and restaurants. So what we did was we partnered with the district businesses and offered and assisted them in offering a contactless drive-through market on Tuesdays, and we did that all the way up until a couple of weeks ago when we started our regular Tuesday market. And so what we've done also in our office, as Brian and Felicia mentioned, and I tell you, I have to say that I'm a little ecstatic that we were already practicing all of those items that they were talking about. I don't think I've talked to our attorney as much as I have in these last 2 months ever. And so, but that was to ensure that we were doing everything. If there was ever a question, I was able to, call our attorney or email our attorney and also our insurance agent, and so that we could stay on top of things. And we also have a executive order guru on our staff who, while I was able to keep up with the office reopening part of those orders, he was able to keep, he was keeping up with the food business and agricultural part of those orders. And so as they changed, we changed, and that has actually been, one of the most successful things about this entire process is being able to change as quickly as we needed to. And so we are grateful for all of our customers, be it our vendors and our shoppers, who also assisted us in this huge adjustment in the way we shop and communicate and laugh and everything with one another here at Eastern Market. I think that is the last slide, and we'll open it up for question and answer.
All right, Doshia. I got a couple of questions, but I'm trying to pare it down that came in before, and everything you shared is wonderful. You did a great job of making your site workplace ready during this time of COVID, but workplace readiness has financial implications for a nonprofit. How have you all been able to shift to make dollars work, or how have you received funding at this time to make the workplace readiness work during COVID? And what long-term implications does that have on your fund development plan?
So during this time, we saw an increase in our corporate and our governmental funding. And so that's how we were able to get we do about 2,000 food boxes a week. And that's just the delivery side of it. And as far as the online food boxes, that's, covered payroll wise, but the food is, provided by vendors and farmers. But we definitely saw an increase in our corporate and government funding. And also we had funders who allowed us to kind of reallocate some funding during this COVID period.
And the second part to that was, how does that impact your long-term financial planning and fund development plan?
Well, we will continue with our fundraising. We have an online donation process, and also actually what we've also seen when people order their food boxes online, they are able to make a donation, a COVID donation is what we call it. And so we've seen an increase in that area as well. And And so we're really just fundraising really hard to maintain, because one of the things, and we our larger vendors who are able to do so continue to make their payments so that we could actually allow some of our day stall and smaller vendors to, even though they were here vending, waive their fees for those
Oh,
markets.
that's wonderful. Oh, that's wonderful, Doshia.
Yes, thank you. And actually, that's what a lot of the funding allowed us to be able to do. So it would make up for the income that we lost. One of the things we also, as you know, Eastern Market also became popular in the facility rental or, private event area. And so that was some income that we lost as well this year. So the increase in corporate, government, and private giving was definitely a help to us.
Thank you. And Kelly, if there's any questions, we may have time for one more question before we get back to Felicia. So if there's any questions that came from the chat.
Yeah, there is actually. So Doshia, and speaking a little bit about how you made the pivot on your fundraising efforts, can you speak about whether, the opportunity for people to make the donations, was there anything you had to do differently as an organization to prepare to accept donations differently than you have?
No, because our giving, donations can be made online, and that was already a process that was in place. The added piece was the one with the food box, and that was just a different platform that we used for that program, and was able to get it added into that platform. So as far as receiving donations, nothing really changed in that area, because they either came, via mail or online.
Great, thank you. Before we begin with a couple of the questions that we have in the audience, there's a shout out to you from Carmen, and just a big thank you because the market helped keep her family fed during the pandemic. So I wanted to make sure you got that feedback and that Carmen knew that we are monitoring the questions. So shout out to you for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Carmen. I'll pass that on.
Okay. Couple other quick questions. One,
Kelly,
are you? Oh, sorry. Yep.
Are we doing more questions now, or should we go back to Felicia?
Oh yeah, just a few questions specific for Doshia in the things that she referenced. So a couple people are wondering if you are requiring all vendors to wear masks, as well as if you're seeing your market attendees wearing, if they have to wear masks. So if you could just speak to who has to wear masks, vendors, attendees, as well as if people are observing social distancing.
We are requiring everyone to wear a mask, including our vendors, our staff, and customers. So we have staff standing at the entrances, letting people know that a mask is required. And if they do not have a mask, we are providing a mask free of charge.
Great, thank you. I think the rest of the questions can wait to the Q&A at the end, but those were definitely burning questions that were coming from the audience that we wanted to address during this portion of the presentation. So Jami, back to you, and to your point, I believe that we are ready to go back to Felicia's part of the presentation.
Exciting.
Back.
Welcome back, Felicia.
Thank you. Well, I also just want
away.
to apologize and thank everyone for their patience, and everybody on the panelists, and Jami also for being nimble, as we have been saying, and Doshia for jumping in and taking over. So hopefully we will not run into the same problem in the next few minutes, but I'll try and go a little bit quickly, just because I know we lost some time during that. So apologies for that, and we will move onward. So I was just going over the two sort of sections that we were going to talk about, which is really the logistics of reopening the workplace, and then also ADA issues and other leave issues that could arise. If we could move on to the next slide, that'd be great. So in terms of reopening the workplace, what you really want to focus on is your local requirements. So here in Michigan, at the outset of this, there were requirements from various counties. Oakland County had its own separate full protocol, and the state had a different protocol, and other counties had their own protocol. So what you want to do is just make sure that you are up to date and you understand where you are located and what orders may be applicable to you. And then in addition to that, under all of the various executive orders, there in the state executive order, the one that's currently in place, because some others were rescinded when the most recent one was issued, there are various requirements for certain industries. So as we know, there are certain requirements for restaurants and bars. Gyms aren't fully open at this point. Restaurants and bars are at 50% capacity. There's certain other restrictions for construction. So depending on the industry in which you operate, you're going to want to make sure that not only do you understand the general requirements for operating in this environment, but also whether there are specific requirements for your type of business and what they are. And as we said, maybe the mantra for this presentation and for COVID in general is be nimble. Everything is changing. These days it has been a little bit less frequent, but in the beginning it was day to day. There were new changes in federal law, in state requirements, in county requirements. You know, it seemed like every time you turn around, every 24 hours, there was something new to think about. So you just want to make sure that you are that you have a group, or you can assign a task force, or, you know, depending on the size of your workforce, a single person or a team who can be in charge of what the requirements are, and reaching out to legal where necessary, or reaching out to, you know, internally or externally, and as well as your insurance. Next slide, please. So in terms of reopening and just some practical advice, really following the CDC guidance is what we recommend. In that CDC guidance, there's a recommendation, not a requirement, but a recommendation for phased reopening, in which you would do, you know, phase one, where you're continuing to encourage people to work remotely as much as possible, enforcing strict social distancing, maybe staggering people's work times, minimizing or cutting out all non-essential travel. And that's sort of the world we're living in now. We're starting to open back up. We have heightened restrictions, and we are enforcing PPE and social distancing and working from home as much as possible. Then as cases continue to decline, and hopefully they do, we can move into phase two, where guest access can resume, and non-essential travel can resume, and you're loosening some of those restrictions that are taking place in the phase one. And then phase three is the back to normal. If that will open, hopefully open and happen someday. Phase three, unrestricted staffing, unrestricted travel, kind of back to January 2020 before this all started. Next slide, please. So in terms of sanitizing, there are various resources for you to seek out where you can understand what type of cleaning you should do in your facility. Again, all this is specific to the type of industry you have, the type of facility you have. You know, is it one where you're preparing food? Is it something that's quasi inside and outside, like Eastern Market? Is it an office space? So the CDC has recommendations, and they have recommendations for products to use and areas that need to be cleaned and how often. What you really want to do high level is focus on high contact surfaces where a lot of people are touching the same things. That means doorknobs, printer buttons. If there's a conference room that people are using, you're reducing capacity in that conference room, and then also frequently cleaning those sections because more than one person is using the same type of equipment. And then high risk locations like bathrooms, break areas, if you have a cafeteria, conference rooms, reception spaces where your clients or the portion of the community that you serve are interacting, coming into your facility, interacting with your employees. Next slide, please. Social distancing. This is one of those dense slides where I'm not going to read everything there, but there are a lot of recommendations for the types of things you can implement. This again depends on whether your businesses perform mostly outside. Is it in an office environment? Are you in a large warehouse where there's a lot of volume of air, or are people close in together? So that is going to determine what type of social distancing you are able to implement, and maybe what percentage of staff you're able to bring back in your phase one. If you're in a smaller environment, I know in my office, there are open cubicles, there's a lot of people, we're riding an elevator. So we're pretty strict in phase one, and it's limited to 25% of people. Now, if you're in an environment that's much more open, where there's open air or the ability to open windows at least, then you can determine. So what you want to do is kind of make an assessment of your specific space. What might be high traffic areas? Do you want to have people only moving in one direction through certain hallways? Are people going to not be able to enter certain areas if there are maybe blocks of cubicles where people are working together? You want to limit how many people can even be in that space at all. So it's all specific to how your office is set up. But the idea is keep people as far apart as possible, make hand washing and sanitation available, and put up signage. The signage at Eastern Market was great, and I think we all should be the kings and queens of signs these days, because that will remind people. It's easy to forget, but if you have signs next to cubicles or in certain hallways saying, this is a one-way hallway, that helps people remember the requirements of social distancing in your facility. Next slide, please. Temperature testing. So we got a lot of questions at the beginning of this because temperature testing technically is a medical examination under the ADA. So you're retaining medical records. What can you do with those? What information are you allowed to have? What questions are you allowed to ask? At this point, it's very accepted that you are permitted to do temperature testing of your employees, along with health screening at the start of each shift, where you're asking questions specifically about symptoms of COVID. What we recommend in terms of temperature testing is not that you're necessarily recording everybody's precise temperature every day, but that you are seeking out a threshold, using a standard threshold. I believe the CDC at one point had 100.3 as the threshold. So find your resources, figure out what threshold you want to use, and then when you're recording people's temperatures, you can just say that they passed, or they were below, or they're above. You don't necessarily need to say, Felicia O'Connor was at 97.8 on Tuesday, June whatever. So that way it's kind of minimizing the risk of the type of health records that you're keeping, but you're still doing your due diligence in terms of whether you're determining if your employees have a temperature when they're entering your workplace. So things to keep in mind: you want to use touchless thermometers. We don't need things going in and out of people's mouths in the workplace. If you're going to have one person taking temperatures, depending on how many temperatures you have to take, if you have a big workforce, or then you may need more than one, but you want to sort of designate it to certain people. Those people need to be trained. They need to have proper PPE to protect themselves and to protect the people whose temperature they're taking. You want to be consistent in the way that you're measuring it. You want to measure everybody every day, so certain people are not getting special treatment. What you don't want to do is make individualized assessments. And by that, I don't mean, you're reading the temperature and determining, but it's more like, well, Brian looks a little unhappy today. We're going to take his temperature because he looks like he might be sick. You want to be consistent in who you're testing and testing everyone. That way you're not making subjective determinations of who's being tested and not being tested. And Brian, sorry to call out your name. I'm sure you're not sick and you're feeling fine, but just to use an example. And so if you do have someone who has a temperature, what you're going to want to do is send them home, recommend that they get tested. If they test positive, they need to report that back to you. Then what you would do is, and I'm getting into some future slides, but you would determine who they've had close contact with in the workplace. Those people need to isolate themselves. There's a whole protocol if you have a positive test. But if someone has a fever and say they test negative for COVID, so you don't need to do all the other things about cleaning the whole facility, et cetera, we recommend that you don't then let that person back into the workplace unless they have a doctor's note or release from a doctor saying that they're permitted to be back. And the same is true if someone tests positive for COVID. It's not a situation where they test positive and then they say, oh, well, I'm feeling better, I'm going to come back now. That's best practice from what we recommend is to get a doctor to release them, because the last thing you want is for someone to think they're feeling better and then actually have a relapse and still be contagious and be in your workplace. So you want that backup of the doctor's note to verify that that person can come back to work. So things to consider are, if you have a lot of employees, how long is it taking to take everybody's temperature? Is that compensable time under the Fair Labor Standards Act? Limit the time they're taking, and also maintaining proper social distance while you are taking temperatures. You don't want a line of people where everybody's jammed up next to each other waiting to have their temperature taken. Next slide, please. PPE and the great mask debate, as Brian said. There are OSHA guidelines in terms of what PPE is required. What you want to do is make individual assessments in terms of the people's jobs and what the risks are to those people. Interestingly, the CDC, as I was looking through their requirements, say multiple times that masks are not PPE because they are protecting other people from the germs that the wearer may have, and they're not protecting the wearer. But I mean, that aside, I think when we say PPE, we can include masks when we're just talking about it kind of casually. But you want to make sure that if you have a requirement that people wear masks, that it is consistently enforced. And if people are raising concerns about wearing masks, one of the things that I wanted to raise just from an employment law perspective is we have seen, not that frequently, but it's happened enough that it's come up more than once, where employees don't want to wear masks and they are, as a reason, they are giving that it's a religious reason. And so I think you just want to be careful about, if you have an employee, if you have a mask policy and you have an employee who's refusing to wear a mask, what you want to do is dig a little bit deeper. In addition to the good advice that Brian gave about de-escalating the situation, you want to dig a little bit deeper and find out why they're not wearing a mask, because if it is a religious concern, then you have a duty to accommodate religious requests for accommodation because of religious reasons. So there are other ways that you can get around someone who doesn't want to wear a mask for religious reasons. They can wear a face shield, or maybe they could be put in a different area of the facility where they might not need to wear a mask. But just something to consider, that flat out refusal sometimes has a more complicating factor if religion is involved. Next slide, please. The ADA and how it figures into COVID-19 and our new world, and what accommodations are frequently coming up in the COVID-19 era, and other things to think about. So we're going to delve into the ADA a little bit. Next slide, please. So I'll just do a little bit of a refresher. The Americans with Disabilities Act is a federal law. A lot of states, including Michigan, also have state laws that also prohibit discrimination based on disability, or whether you regard someone as disabled. So you have a duty to accommodate folks who have a disability under the ADA or state law, and your duty is to provide a reasonable accommodation to qualified individuals with disabilities, unless it would cause an undue hardship. And that undue hardship is a pretty high standard. So it's not something that we frequently run into, where an accommodation could be an undue hardship. I mean, there certainly are there certainly are scenarios where what someone's asking just really isn't reasonable. There is no reasonable accommodation. But in general, if someone has a requirement, like they're not able to wear face masks for because they have a breathing issue, and that would be a disability under the ADA, and they can't wear a certain kind of mask, then you have a duty to accommodate that person if there is a reasonable accommodation that allows them to perform their job. It also, the ADA addresses medical inquiries, and so that's where the recommendation around testing and other medical inquiries kind of comes into play because it is a part of the ADA. Next slide, please. So the EEOC has issued guidance on several occasions. I'm not going to get into all of it because we don't have time, but you should know that is a resource for you. It's a pretty user-friendly website where you can find various Q&As and information about how the EEOC thinks about COVID-19 and reasonable accommodations and discrimination on employees based on disability, but also they've recently, in addition to that, issued some guidance based on what they would consider discrimination of employees based on age. So, you know, for instance, in terms of EEOC guidance, one of the things you want to be careful of, you know, is if you have employees who are over the age of 65, and you may think that that you're doing a good thing by saying something like, for their own benefit, they're not permitted back in the office, we're going to protect them. But really, you don't want to be treating those employees who are over 65, and really under federal law, it's over 40, but you know, in terms of the pandemic, we know that 65 is kind of a level where people are at higher risk. You don't want to be treating them different than your other employees. But that being said, you do want to make accommodations for folks if they request them and need them. Next slide, please. So permitted inquiries, there was a question really when all this began about how much you could even ask an employee about what their symptoms were or what their health conditions were. And in general, if all this was not going on, you wouldn't be out there asking employees whether they have a disability and how that might affect their job. Really, it's an employee who would raise that to you. So since this has started, and because it's important to protect the rest of your workforce from infection, you are permitted to take steps to determine if employees entering the workplace have COVID-19 because they pose a threat to other employees. So the EEOC has come out, and this quote is in quotes, this is a quote from the EEOC that has come out with recent guidance saying, yes, you are permitted to ask your employees about symptoms related to COVID-19. Next slide, please. So permitted examinations, as we mentioned under the ADA, there are certain restrictions surrounding medical examinations under the ADA. So here are a few types of examinations that come up under coronavirus concerns and how they are addressed by the ADA. So taking temperature, we talked about that already. One thing to keep in mind is just taking temperatures is really not fully protecting your workforce, because as we know, there are asymptomatic people who can spread it or pre-symptomatic people who can spread COVID if they are positive. So you still, even if you're taking temperatures, you really want to make sure that you're still doing all the sanitization and social distancing and mask wearing that you would otherwise require even if you weren't taking temperatures. In terms of COVID-19 testing, the EEOC has come out and said that an employer may choose to actually administer tests to employees or require tests to require employees to take tests before they enter the workplace. Now, antibody testing, which is come on the scene a little bit more recently, and what antibody testing is from what I understand, a blood test versus the nasal test that would show whether an employee has antibodies that would show that they did already have COVID-19, and that may be if they currently have it or if they previously had it. So at this point, the antibody tests are not reliable enough, and the science just really is not there to say that even if you did have COVID and you're not currently infected and you have these antibodies, that you couldn't necessarily get it again. I think that's probably what we all hope, that if someone had it, then they're protected, but the science is not quite there yet. So in terms of antibody testing,
All right, it appears we have lost the connection again. So let's give it a minute to see if Felicia comes back. She did bounce back pretty quickly last time, so just want to acknowledge that we had lost the connection here. So I'm going to give it a minute to see if she comes back, because I know there's a lot of questions and interest in her slides at this point. All right, you're back. Oh, for a minute. Again, just asking for your patience as we wait to see if she can log back in here.
Hello? Hopefully people can hear me now, I think.
Yes, we can hear you. Yep.
Oh, good. Thank you. Hush.
That's okay. Keep
The
going.
challenges of 2020. Okay, so I'm going to go fast so that we don't get stuck again, and I think we're getting close on time as well. If we can move on to the next slide, that'd be great. Reasonable accommodations and working from home. This is going to be, I think, the next new topic. If you could move on one more slide. In the past, it was perfectly valid for a company to say that you required everyone to be at work in person and that working from home was not a reasonable accommodation, and there were various court cases to that effect as well. There was one famous one, a Ford case here in Michigan, stating that it was a reasonable accommodation to work at home. That was later walked back a little bit. So in the past, it was, you were able to require that employees be in the office. Now, I think it's going to be a little bit harder to do that because we've all been working at home for about, some 2 months, some more like 4 months. Then it's harder to say that it's not reasonable and not possible to have people working from home. So it's going to be a little bit of a tougher assessment. However, the most recent Michigan executive order has changed the remote work requirements to saying everyone who can must work at home, to saying that you should encourage it where you can, but it's not a requirement anymore, at least under the current executive order. So the question is, under your job descriptions, is attendance an essential function? In certain industries, obviously that is going to be true. In manufacturing, people are working on the line, they have to be physically present. It's just a function of their job. And in office, it's a little bit different, but if you have frequent team meetings or there's a reason why It's more efficient to have people in the office. You just want to make those assessments. But really, it's a case-by-case analysis. And if a person has a disability, and we have seen on a few occasions where someone has a disability under the ADA, may not have COVID, but may be at higher risk because of their disability and wishes to work from home. In that kind of scenario, you're going to want to do the individual analysis like you would ordinarily under the ADA to understand what the requirements of their job are and whether working from home would be a reasonable accommodation, keeping in mind that if they have been working at home and it has been working, it's going to be hard for you to say that it's not possible for them to work at home. Next slide, please. Next slide. Leave issues, and I'll hit on these really lightly. They're pretty complicated, and it's a scenario where you probably want to reach out to legal counsel. Whether people are need extended leave and they are delayed in their return to work, there's the FFCRA to think about, which is the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. It's a federal law. It applies to employers with less than 500 employees. And it permits leave for folks in various scenarios, including if they test positive, if they've been exposed to someone who tests positive, if they're taking care of a family member who has symptoms, if they're seeking a diagnosis. So there are a variety of scenarios where a person may be entitled to paid leave, 2 weeks of paid leave under the FFCRA. In addition, it expanded the FMLA, Family Medical Leave Act, and for scenarios where employees have childcare issues because schools and daycares and various camps have all been closed. And that provides for up to 10 paid weeks at 2/3 of folks' pay. So if you have questions about the FFCRA, I recommend reaching out to legal counsel, but it's just something to kind of keep in mind that people may be entitled to paid leave under the FFCRA. In addition, there's the Michigan Paid Sick Leave Act, which applies to employers with 50 or more employees, and it applies to non-exempt hourly employees. And under the Michigan Paid Sick Leave Act, as you probably know, if it applies to you, employees are entitled up to 40 hours of paid leave if they're sick or if they're taking care of a sick family member. The definitions under there have been expanded a bit to include COVID-19 situations. So if people have COVID-19 symptoms, if they are taking care of someone who's tested positive, the Michigan Paid Sick Leave Act, under an executive order by Governor Whitmer, has been expanded to include some coronavirus scenarios. So you just want to be aware of that. So if you have people who are going on leave, does the FFCRA apply to you? Does the scenario qualify them for leave under the FFCRA? Does the Michigan Paid Sick Leave Act apply to you? Does it apply to this employee? Have they already used their time? So it can get kind of complicated, but it's just something to kind of raise a flag if you have employees who are taking sick leave as to whether one of these things applies to them and whether you might be required to provide them with paid leave. In addition, as you may know, under the ADA, even if someone had exhausted all of their other leave, if they were, and this is, pre-COVID-19, if someone has exhausted their short-term disability and exhausted their FMLA, leave can still be a reasonable accommodation under the ADA. So even if someone is out of their Michigan Paid Sick Leave Act hours and they don't have any PTO anymore, and they've exhausted FMLA, they still may be entitled to leave under the ADA. So as people are taking extended leaves for various reasons, you just want to keep that in mind as well. Now, the ADA really only applies to people who have a disability themselves, and it won't apply to an employee who wants to delay their return to work because they live with someone who is high risk or they're taking care of someone who may have a disability. So all these laws sort of intersect in a complicated way. So I think in terms of reasonable accommodations, it's good to know that you should call employment counsel or talk to your internal legal counsel, because all of these scenarios can be implicated as someone's taking leave or requesting leave in this current pandemic situation. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. We're going to talk a little bit about PPE and reasonable accommodations. Masks and face shields and gloves. We've hit on this a bit, and I know Brian did too, and so did Doshia. we're going to, require masks when you're in common areas. And again, it's that an individual assessment of your workplace and what might be required for various locations and also for various job functions, determined by what the location is like. Is it inside? Is it outside? Are you in close quarters with other folks? Next slide, please. Future consideration. So what do we see going forward? Working from home, I think, is going to be a big issue going forward because all those leave acts are pretty complicated. We in labor and employment litigation are anticipating an uptick in claims based on denial of leave or denial of reasonable accommodations. And so those are all things to kind of keep in mind. We've heard talk about immunity certificates. If you pass an antibody test, are you then permitted to move about freely and you don't have to wear a mask? I mean, the science not quite there yet. So we are not at a point where I think you could say if someone has a positive antibody test that, they're free and clear to do what they want. So you want to just keep in mind that while that may sound good in the future, that if someone has antibodies, it's helpful to them. Really, we're not quite there yet. And then in addition, because a lot of folks have not been able to, or for their own reasons or because of their doctor's office restrictions, have not been able to go see doctors physically in person. And in the beginning, tests were very hard to get a hold of. Then the question is, how do we deal with televisits and how do we deal with doctor's notes in a scenario where it's harder to go to the doctor and it may be harder to get a physically written note from a doctor's office, and how to deal with televisits in general in a scenario where you would probably be asking for doctor's notes more often and also in your ordinary scenarios. Next slide, please. So what the future holds, unfortunately, we see in some parts of the country an uptick in cases. Will we see an uptick in cases here in Michigan in the fall and winter? The experts are saying yes, but I suppose that all remains to be seen. I think it behooves you to be prepared for that eventuality. And then, as we discussed before, working from home, 18 months from now, where we want everybody to be back in the office and maybe there is a vaccine and there's not really a reason to kind of have everybody who can work from home, that you're going to have the employees who want to keep working from home. And how are you going to address that? Do they have a disability? Is it a reasonable accommodation, et cetera? And then, I've also heard of some companies who say, hey, this working from home is great and it actually helps us on our office space and we don't have to pay as much. So things to consider in terms of working from home and how the office really may have just changed for good moving forward based on what we're going through right now. Next slide, please. And I think that may be the last one. That's right. So thanks again for your patience, everyone, Jami and Kelly as well, as I dealt with my technical issues. I appreciate your understanding.
Oh, we thank you for working through it and staying with us. You gave us some great information. You may have an extra request for legal counsel. I'm not saying it's going to come from one of my organizations, but
That's right.
it may come. One of the questions that I got beforehand is from an organization that does weekly self-checks with calls with their employees, and they were really interested in what does it look like. Is it legal to require a test before coming in to work? And also, what should you legally do if an employee, visitor, volunteer, contract employee gets sick on your premises? Like, what legal protections do you have, or what should you prepare for?
Sure, yeah. So we went through testing a little bit. It is legal to require employees to get tested before coming back. I don't think testing capacity is probably at the level where you can be testing employees every day for coronavirus, although I think that happens in some places, in some, specialized, maybe in healthcare, some specialized areas. But the answer really is yes, especially if you have an employee who's positive. What you want to do is ask for that doctor's note to have them come back, and you want to If it's available, you can ask them to have a coronavirus test. I think what you want to ask them for is for a diagnostic test, not an antibody test. The antibody tests may show whether they had it, but they're not going to show whether they're infectious. So you want to make sure that when you're asking people for tests, you're being specific about diagnostic tests. And then we have created a whole protocol for if you have someone who tests positive in your facility, one of your employees or a visitor. And Oakland County also, and so I think this shows that you have to kind of keep up on local requirements. In Oakland County, there was a whole protocol for if someone tested positive, and you had to identify people, and everyone had to be sent home for 14 days, and etc. So now that has lifted because the state executive orders are in effect, and the various counties have rescinded their orders, but you just want to keep up on whether there are local legal requirements. Terms of advice generally, what we say is if you have an employee who reports that they have tested positive, you want to take a look at who they have been in contact with in your workplace. Is it someone who's just in their office and maybe they, touch door handles in and out, or is it someone who has contact with a lot of employees in a close environment? You want to identify those employees that they have had contact with, close contact. And you may want to send those employees home and require them to stay home for 14 days to see if they're showing symptoms. The last thing you want is for it to be running through your, for employees' sake and for your business sake, to have a lot of employees be testing positive and infecting each other at your workplace. I mean, for liability reasons and just for logistical reasons and for, moral reasons. So you want to identify the person, who they have been in close contact with, what areas of your facility they have been in. You want to, and what we have asked too is you can ask that employee whether they want to, whether they're willing to allow you to disclose their name to the other employees. Some employees will be, some employees will not. Regardless of that, you want to identify who they've been around and inform those people that they may have been exposed so they can watch themselves for symptoms. And you want to close your facility. Well, it depends on how extensive their contact with your facility has been. If you have somebody who's been all over your office, you probably want to shut it down and do a complete sanitization of your office. And there are a lot of companies that offer those. I know Brian mentioned one where they come in and do a deep clean and sanitize everything.
Thank you, Felicia. I do want to remind those that are watching that MCR has a legal clinic where we can have lawyers review your plans for employment and volunteer policies. You can find out more information at mi-community.org. And I do want to open up the space for any questions that may have come through the chat. So Kelly, do we have any great questions coming through?
We do.
We got some great information.
Of course we do. That was a lot of really great information. So one of the questions that came through, and it's actually got two parts. Do you know of a resource that's out there that helps break down the executive orders? And also, could you tell us what executive order number we are on right now?
Sure. There is a resource if you go to the website of the state government, and I think it's michigan.gov, and it's like /coronavirus. There's a whole coronavirus resource center there on the state government's website. There is a link to the executive orders, and it has a list of all the executive orders. You can just go there. The most recent ones, it's a little counterintuitive. The most recent ones are actually at the bottom. So at the top are older ones. And it says on there whether certain orders have been rescinded. It's a little bit complicated because there have been a lot. I'd have to look at the list now because I feel like there's some every day, but we're up in the hundreds of executive orders, but they apply to various things. So there'll be an executive order that extends the state of emergency. That may not really have that much impact on your business. The executive orders that are tailored to food service may have an impact on your business. So it really kind of depends what type of industry you're in. But the Michigan state website does have a link that lists all the executive orders, and it has a little blurb for each link that kind of says what it's about, so you can tell whether it might apply to you. In addition, and not to make plugs for Foley, but we have a whole coronavirus resource center as well that goes through the various executive orders, and it goes through all kinds of different information about the various state laws, and you can sort by topic, and you can sort by date. So it's also easy to find a lot of good information on our website, which is bowley.com.
Great, thank you. I think we've got time for this last question here that may also apply not only to you, Felicia, but also Brian. You may have some insight into this question too. If sick leave is not paid, some insurance carriers will not provide health insurance coverage. Is the sick leave and the ADA both paid leave?
So under the ADA, even though leave is an accommodation, the ADA really doesn't provide for any paid leave. So if you're giving an employee leave as an accommodation under the ADA, it's unpaid. And whether employees are entitled to paid leave is going to vary based on a few factors. One is the FFCRA, which is the federal law I mentioned that provide for paid leave for various scenarios. So it depends on if that applies to your business, and it depends on whether the employee has a qualifying reason under the FFCRA. But that is, if they do, it's 80 hours, it's 2 weeks at full pay for certain scenarios. And then, as I mentioned, in the child care, there's an expansion of the FMLA, which is 2/3 pay for a longer period of time. Then there's the Michigan Paid Sick Leave Act, which has been expanded to include some coronavirus scenarios. So you want to look again at what the exact condition is that the employee has. Are they entitled to paid leave under the Michigan Paid Sick Leave Act? Does the Michigan Paid Sick Leave Act apply to your business? Only if you have 50 or more employees. So if you have less than that, then that's not an option. And then you want to look at employees' PTO, and that depends on your own PTO or sick leave policy. You know, have they used their bank of paid leave? So there are a few factors, but in general, like the FMLA, if you're just awarding leave as an accommodation under the ADA, it's not necessarily paid. It's just the right to take leave from your job and then return to your job. So the paid leave comes in those other laws, the FFCRA, Michigan Paid Sick Leave Act, and then also your PTO policy.
Great. Thank you. I also have one last question. I'm going to blend 3 questions into one, but they kind of have the same spirit to them. So I'm hoping that I can make sure that we did our best job possible in getting as many questions answered today. The questions that I'm looking at really are in the same spirit of refusal of employees to be tested. So a couple of the questions come from, one, can individuals self-report their own temperatures? So that's one part. Another part is some have indicated that they feel it is improper an intrusion into their personal circumstances to answer questions about their health and temperature. How does an organization handle that? Again, back to the refusal to get tested. Do we need the doctor's note to keep them away? And what is our risk management factors for insurance coverage? And then lastly, I told you I was going to make it loaded. We've talked about the ADA. Can someone use the ADA to refuse to take a COVID-19 test? So I apologize that I just kind of peppered you with a lot of questions in one. Technically, it's one question. It's just peppered with a lot of specifics. So if you could, in the last couple minutes that we have, I think people would really benefit and appreciate hearing a little more insight to those questions.
Sure, absolutely. And I'll let Brian address the insurance issue. But in terms of refusal to take a test, well, first, one of the questions you asked is, can employees report their own temperature? If you want to institute a protocol where employees are reporting their own symptoms and their own temperature, you can do that. You don't have to have someone at the door of your facility taking people's temperatures if you don't want to implement that kind of practice. We do recommend that you're asking employees whether they have coronavirus symptoms. It doesn't necessarily have to include what their temperature is, but you can have a form that they fill out at the beginning of each shift. So we recommend that you're screening in some way. It can be self-reported and you don't have to take temperatures, but if you have a protocol where you are taking temperatures and that's the way that you want to implement it, then you can require employees to abide by your protocol or otherwise not be permitted to return to work. So I think if you have a scenario where you have an employee who's refusing to provide any information because they feel like it's an intrusion, it's not necessarily, I mean, they don't have to provide, if they have a disability, what their disability is or why they may be high risk, but you are entitled, and the EEOC has said this, the CDC has said this, and the governor has said this, you are entitled to inquire of your employees and screen your employees upon entry, because it's about protecting your other employees. And so the employer really does not have a right in that scenario to say, I'm not going to answer any questions, I'm not going to have my temperature taken, and you have to let me in anyway. So if you have instituted a protocol and you are implementing it in a consistent way for all employees, then you can require employees to, fill out your form about symptoms or answer your questions about symptoms. Now, if you're asking intrusive questions about what their disabilities may be or other health conditions, then it's a little bit more of a gray area at that point. But you are entitled to ask about symptoms, and you are entitled to take people's temperatures if you want to do that. And if employees refuse, then you can refuse them entry to the workplace because it's just not safe for your other employees.
Felicia, that was a great summary. One of the things that I would elaborate on is the policies and procedures that are in place to have those in writing. And then if the situation does happen, consult with your employment practices insurance carrier and let them know of a notice of circumstance or a potential circumstance with the details. What this does is it helps if there is a employment practices claim for a discrimination type event, it puts it on record. And another helpful resource that they may have if they don't consult with you prior is if they have an employment practices insurance policy in place, oftentimes there is 2 hours free legal service from a law firm provided by the insurance carrier. So they can ask some questions either prior to an event or post-event to get some legal advice as well. So again, document, implement, and follow the process, and they should be well protected.
Thank you both. I think because I was able to pepper all of it into one question, I think that we are good with the questions from the audience. I do not see any additional questions that have come in to be asked. So with that, I'd like to say thank you again to our presenters. Again, we appreciate everybody's patience today as we work through some of our technical difficulties, but in the end, I hope that it was of benefit to all of your organizations and to you individually as you continue to be nimble, flexible, and think about what the return to work space looks like. Again, I appreciate and would like to thank Doshia, Felicia, Brian, and Jami for their fabulous presentation. We also like to thank all of you for participating. We have a brief survey that will pop up at the end of this webinar. We would be so thankful and grateful if you would take a couple minutes. It only does take a couple minutes to provide some feedback. It is invaluable to the planning team as we look at developing future sessions and content. And speaking of future sessions, please join us and register for sessions on your screen, as well as additional ones that we will promote in the future to really make sure that we're providing content to you that is helpful as you think about reimagining the nonprofit workplace. Again, we're grateful for everybody's participation today, and we hope you have a great weekend. Thank you for joining us.